Good morning to our American viewers and good afternoon to those in Europe. Welcome to the 10th Annual EU Defence Washington Forum. My name is Neeme Raud. I'm a journalist here in Estonia and I will be hosting your host for the next 2 days. To give this event a true transatlantic vibe, I'm joining you from this beautiful studio, as I said, from Tallinn, Estonia. EU Defence Washington Forum is the flagship event on security and defence that the European Union delegation to the United States has been organizing already since 2011. This year, the delegation has partnered with the Centre for Strategic and International Studies with a common goal to promote transatlantic dialogue on security and defence. I'm sure there are many among you who are attending this forum already for the second or a third time, who have been previously either as speakers or participants. We are glad to see you join us again for this special 10th edition that will be held in a hybrid format. Also, a warm welcome to all of you who are tuning in for the first time. Over the next 2 days, we'll be joined by leaders in defense and security from both sides of the Atlantic to reaffirm the shared values and interests of the EU and the United States and to discuss the challenges and opportunities for cooperation ahead. Our forum takes place about 2 weeks after the NATO and the EU-U.S. summits in Brussels. It is also the first forum since the Biden administration took office earlier this year. We look forward to hearing new perspectives on transatlantic security and defense. But before we get started, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. You can find the forum agenda and speaker information by scrolling down the page at csis.org. It is also located below the video player on your screens. We encourage your viewers, to participate in the conversation. To ask a question, use the Ask Live Questions Here button at the center of the page or tag us on a social media using the hashtag EUDefense. And keep in mind the word defense is with an S. Additionally, all of our today's conversations are on the record and will be recorded. You can find the recordings on the EU in the US YouTube page. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Stavros Lambrinidis, and President of the CSIS, Dr. John Hamre, for their welcoming remarks. Mr. Ambassador, the screen is yours.
Good morning, dear online viewers from both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. I am pleased to launch the 10th EU Defence Washington Forum together with a true friend of Europe, Dr. John Hamre, President of the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you to CSIS, in particular to John and to Heather Conby and her team, for partnering with us on this annual flagship transatlantic event on security and defence. The EU and US together represent 780 million people, bound by a shared history, shared alliances, shared interests, and shared values, including support for democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Together, we have built the world's largest and most open trade and investment relationship, benefiting millions of citizens and businesses on both sides of the Atlantic. But, and this is a big but, this is far more than an economic relationship. Together, we have a commitment and a responsibility to build a more democratic, a more peaceful, and a more secure world, both for the world itself and for our citizens, of course. And it is this aspect of the transatlantic relationship that is the focus of our discussions today and tomorrow. Now, our forum takes place 2 weeks after the EU-U.S. summit and the NATO summit. During his visit to Brussels, President Biden confirmed his ironclad commitment to NATO and to the European Union relationship. We see this in reinvigorated transatlantic relations, notably a solid list of concrete deliverables agreed at the EU-U.S. summit that includes launching a dedicated EU-U.S. dialogue on security and defense for the first time. We have agreed to work together to address global challenges, including the current pandemic we are still battling, the threat posed by autocratic actors such as China or Russia, the climate change crisis, and the undermining of the multilateral system. Security threats are increasingly complex, but we know that we are stronger when we are together. That is why it is also so important that we continue to strengthen and to deepen EU-U.S. as well as EU-NATO cooperation. Now, we have seen how quickly the global pandemic generated a terrible death toll and disrupted the world's economy and our way of life. We have seen security challenges amplified, from disinformation campaigns to cyber attacks, including against critical infrastructure. The pandemic has exacerbated poverty levels, existing inequalities, and human suffering around the world, all eventually real security threats. Climate change is a long-term security challenge and a threat multiplier that affects us all. It has become even more urgent to strengthen the resilience of our societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Because, speaking about security and defense, strong societies are the first line of defense. Now, we Europeans understand the need to do our part to step out our responsibility to address security threats, increase defense spending, and improve our capabilities. We will not only spend more, but also spend better. We're also looking forward to stepping up EU-US cooperation on defense. The US joining the PESCO military mobility project is an important and concrete step towards closer EU-US partnership in defense. It will bring our operational cooperation on defense at an entirely new level. A stronger European Union on security and defense is also a stronger partner for the US and strengthens the European pillar of NATO. This is worth repeating over and over again. Finally, dear friends, while this forum is called the EU-Washington Defense Forum, security entails a multitude of interconnected elements that feed into each other to create an unbreakable security chain, as I've alluded to before. Resilience, safe communications, protection of critical infrastructure, new technologies, and the fight against climate change, in addition to strengthening of capabilities. All these are parts of a chain. We will touch on all of these topics at this year's forum. Over the next 2 days, you will hear from several foreign and defense ministers, senior representatives from the US administration, European Union and United States military leaders, and our partners from NATO. You will also hear from some of the best transatlantic security experts outside of government, who play a key role in contributing to the debate and supporting our unique partnership. So stay with us. And now, without further ado, let me give the floor to John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Lambrinidis. It's a real privilege to be with you, especially to be with you. And I admire your leadership here in Washington. And I want to say greetings to all of my friends in Europe. Delighted to have this opportunity to be with you. Forgive me for making this just a bit personal, but I think my own life reflects the transition that America is making and needs to make. I grew up and worked as a defense guy my whole life, and I thought about Europe in terms of NATO, and I really didn't think about the EU. Typical. I'm a typical American, probably typical defense guy. But over my professional journey these last 20 years at CSIS, I've moved from skepticism to amazement to admiration about the European Union. My goodness, it's a remarkable development over the last 20 years. I would like to pick up on the very important point that the ambassador just made about strong societies being the foundation of security. America's had historically five distinct epochs of foreign policy. The fifth epoch was the Cold War period. These last 20, 30 years have really been an extension of the Cold War period, but without the danger, I suppose. But we're now distinctly in a sixth epoch, a very unique epoch, and it's a competition against authoritarian countries, especially China and Russia, but especially China. And it's not a conflict that's about military might. It's about economic power. It's about technology. And so Ambassador Lambrinidis' comment was exactly right. This new epoch is not about, so much about aircraft carriers and tanks and army divisions. It's about the dynamism of our society. It's about the creativity of our economies. It's the degree to which we, as shared democracies and free enterprise democracies, collaborate with each other. China begins with a market of 1.4 billion consumers. They embrace state capitalism, so that their economy enjoys all the support of the federal government, of the central government. They don't have to. There's no cost of capital. There's no requirement for making a profit. European and American companies are at a distinct disadvantage. We can only deal with this security problem, and the ambassador was exactly right. This is about the foundation of security, which is our economy and our society. We can only deal with that if we address the foundations ourselves about our societies, our economies. So I'm an old NATO guy, but I have to say that me and my NATO buddies don't get what's really going on. We now need to be working far more closely with the European Union, because it's the European Union that is the agent for the strengthening the foundations that are going to be needed for this great competition. So this conference is very timely. I'm embarrassed to say we worked very hard to try to get senior defense officials in the U.S. to join this conference, and we couldn't. They didn't feel it was necessary. They missed the point. They missed the point. The central foundational question of security in this epoch is about our economies. It's about our technological innovation. It's the way that we cooperate as partner societies in building a stronger, more peaceful and prosperous Euro-Atlantic community. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. I look forward to this conference. It's very timely. Ambassador, you and your team have done a splendid job, just a terrific job in carrying the flag here in Washington. We need to do more, because that is the foundation for how we're going to change the attitude in Washington, to help people understand it's about the strength of our societies, the strength of our economies. That's what's going to secure us in this new era. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you for these thought-provoking opening remarks, Mr. Ambassador and Dr. Hamre. As the world slowly starts to re-emerge from the COVID pandemic, Europe and the United States are facing myriad challenges and threats to international security and stability. Here to share his view on the EU's strategic outlook, also assessment of global threats and security and defense cooperation with the United States, is the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Joseph Borrell.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, this year's European Union Washington Defense Forum, our flashing event on security and defense in the US, takes place after the recent EU-U.S. summit in Brussels, which I would call a reencounter which opened new chapter in transatlantic relations, in general and in the field of security and defense especially. We are pleased to see the fundamentally different approach of the new US administration to work together closely with Europe to address the common challenges we face. Last December, the European Union adopted a joint communication on a new EU-U.S. agenda for global change, calling for a strong and ambitious transatlantic agenda. It provides a solid basis for us to join forces to counter common geopolitical security challenges, hybrid and cyber threats, disinformation, terrorism, and climate change. These issues are crucial for our people's security, which is why the EU and the United States should and will work together when it comes to defining common norms in facing global threats and defending common values. Our united action is key when dealing with such challenges, and the EU wants to increase its capacity to act as a stronger and more reliable global security provider. With new global threats on the rise, the US consequently steps up its efforts and focuses on strengthening the transatlantic partnership. And a stronger Europe, it's also on the US interest. The more EU member states invest and cooperate on defense, the stronger and more reliable partner the European Union will be. European Union Security and Defence Initiative contribute to both European and transatlantic security, enhancing the ability of the Union to take care of its own security and making it a stronger global partner for the US. Our initiatives are also designed to ensure coherence with NATO and to contribute to a more balanced transatlantic burden sharing. For instance, improving the movement of forces and military equipment across and beyond Europe. That's key for our common security. That's why our invitation to the US to join the PESCO project, called Military Mobility, is such an important step towards in our defense and our defense cooperations. Ladies and gentlemen, the recent EU-U.S. summit that was there reaffirmed the importance of our strategic partnership, as well as the solidity and relevance of the transatlantic bond. We launched a dedicated dialogue on security and defense based on a common vision of transatlantic security, which demonstrates our shared commitment to transatlantic security. There are many other initiatives that underline the new chapter that we are opening. But I stop here and will not elaborate on the numerous global threats we jointly face, knowing that the upcoming panels and the excellent speakers and experts gathered in the next 2 days will do so. I am really very sorry not to be present to learn from all of you. I thank our team and the Center for Strategic and International Studies for setting up this event, and I wish all productive and successful forum. Once again, I'm really very sorry not to be here to share with you this wonderful forum with so many panelists and so many interesting issues we are going to talk and to deal with. I hope next year we will be able to attend. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. High Representative. Now that we heard the European perspective, let's go back to Washington. I will turn things over to Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia and the Arctic at CSIS, Heather Conley, for a conversation with the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, Jonathan Feiner. Heather, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you, and I could not be more grateful that John Feiner is joining us, Deputy National Security Advisor, to roll up our sleeves and get into this conversation. John, first I want to say congratulations on such a successful presidential visit. 4 summits, that's a little bit of an overachievement, but we're delighted everyone's back, and now we're sorting out all the good work that happened during these summits. And, you know, the first challenge I think anyone has is they're sitting at the White House looking at all the pressing global challenges is priorities. So I'd love to hear from you, giving your thoughts on, from the White House perspective, really the global strategic priorities. Strategies are about choice, and it's hard to prioritize those challenges, but we would welcome to hear your thoughts from the White House perspective. Over to you.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Heather, and to CSIS for having me here. And you're right. I think we set a high bar on this first presidential overseas trip. I think there'd been a lot of, frankly, pent-up diplomatic energy based on the lack of ability to engage during the course of the pandemic. And I know the president was really looking to getting overseas and to being able to interact in person with his key counterparts. And we felt good about how that all played out, and happy to talk about it more. On priorities, I think you're exactly right. For a country like the United States that has global interests, setting priorities can be both an opportunity and a challenge. But I think what you've seen in the course of this trip in particular is that the President is really making good on his commitment that everything we do in foreign policy is going to be with and through our key partnerships and alliances. That's not just rhetoric. That's really how he sees the world. He sees that as a huge force multiplier and strategic advantage for the United States that, frankly, had been allowed to atrophy during the course of the previous 4 years before we came back to office. And so we talk a lot about China. You know, you hear Secretary Austin in the defense context talk about it as the pacing threat for the country. We definitely declare that as being our top strategic priority. But even our engagement vis-a-vis China is going to have to be conducted in partnership, in close coordination with our key partners and allies, and that really starts in Europe.
Absolutely, John. And I think someone who used to be the foreign policy speechwriter for then Vice President Biden, you have the president's instincts. You know how he thinks about these things. And I've been struck by President Biden's reframing, I would argue, of sort of the international system as we see it. We have gone from a national security strategy that looks at the world through a great power competition lens, a strategic competitor. The president is framing this as democracies versus autocracies. Tell us how that reframing, as you think through the priorities, whether it's China, climate change, help us understand that framing, and then again, place our European Union allies right in that. How does that work?
Sure. Well, the last two U.S. administrations, had prioritized either great power competition or transnational threats, respectively. You know, our view coming into office in the moment that we find ourselves in is that we didn't have the luxury of picking one of those two challenges. The United States is challenged fundamentally by both, as are our partners and allies, and that we needed to keep our eye on both balls, not just great power competition, which characterized the Trump administration's approach, but also elevating transnational threats like the pandemic and like climate change and others, which really was at the forefront of how the Obama administration described this strategic landscape. And so, you know, I think you saw that play out in the course of the summits. There was quite a bit of discussion about China, quite a bit of discussion about Russia, particularly in the run-up to the president's conversation with President Putin, but also lots of activity, lots of frankly, progress on climate change and on the pandemic, and particularly the vaccine deliverable that came out of the G7. And I think that's really the core of what the president means when he talks about democracy and autocracy. He is not talking about a Cold War style kind of twilight struggle between the two systems. He is talking about a competition essentially about which system can deliver better for our people in our countries, for the world, which system can best address the big problems that we face. And we're making a big bet that that's democracies. The president says often betting against democracy, betting against the United States has not been a good bet historically. We believe that fundamentally, but we have to put up.
Absolutely. John, I was really struck, again, the sequencing of the president's trip. He met with our G7 allies and then with our allies at the NATO table, at the US-EU table, before he went to Geneva to meet with President Putin. There has been an extraordinary amount of coordination and collaboration between the United States and the European Union vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Belarus. After our conversation, our next panel is going to be exactly on this topic, and specifically hybrid warfare, cyber, disinformation, illicit financing, something that I know, particularly anti-corruption, the Biden administration is really focusing on. Help us understand, again, in security and defense, which is a large basket, where can the U.S. and the EU play an even more productive role when it comes to addressing the challenges that Russia poses?
So I think you're absolutely right about the sequencing, which, you know, as you know, is never accidental. I think we believed it was critically important. We talk often in this administration about engaging the world from a position of strength. For the United States, that meant getting our arms around the pandemic inside our own country. It meant getting our economy on stronger footing. And frankly, fundamentally, it meant getting our partnerships and alliances into a better condition even as we, and even in some cases before we started to engage countries with which we have a much more challenging relationship. And so I think you saw that play out both thematically and substantively in the course of the president's visit to Europe. He saw the G7, he saw his European Union counterparts, he saw his NATO counterparts, and then he went into the conversation with President Putin, able to say, look, the West is aligned and is on the same page with regard to both the opportunities and the threats posed by Russia. And Russia has now the ability to decide what sort of relationship it wants with us. And that is going to fundamentally play out over the course of the coming months. The president was extremely clear with President Putin, as he had been in their telephone conversations, that there are certain aspects of Russia's behavior that not only the United States, but our partners and allies find fundamentally unacceptable. That is, to a large extent, steps that have been taken in the cyber domain. It is aggressive actions that Russia has taken in its near abroad. It is its treatment of dissidents, both at home and abroad. And the president is able to engage very directly, very candidly, while also offering Russia the opportunity to try to find areas in which we can work together. And we're going to test that proposition. You know that coming out of the conversation with the Russians, we are planning to launch these strategic stability talks. We think that is fundamentally in our interest, in all of our partners and allies' interest, to be able to have arms control conversations with the Russians. We are going to need to show progress on the set of cyber issues in which there has been, frankly, some very disturbing events that have taken place in recent months. And we're going to be testing the proposition that Russia is able to actually bring about change that is positive in that area. And we will hold them accountable, frankly, for actions that take place from their territory, whether they are state actions or conducted by criminals.
Yeah, those strong messages, those red lines are very powerful, and they take all of us with our allies in holding leaders account. Let me turn to China. We talked about how important the economic relationship is. Where would you like to prioritize the U.S.-EU relationship vis-a-vis China? We now have a Trade and Technology Council. We know, again, the technology is so important, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so on China and to some extent on Russia, the U.S. engagement with the EU and with Europe broadly is about who is writing the rules by which responsible states, will behave. In the cyber domain, the United States has updated its cyber policy. NATO and the United States together, their cyber policy for the first time in 7 years, which is frankly a big step towards how these issues should be engaged in by, again, responsible countries. And that will then be extended to conversations with our adversaries as well. On the set of economic issues, as you say, the launch of this Trade and Technology Council is fundamentally about two things. One, the United States has some differences with our European partners and allies. It is working through them. And you saw a major step forward in working through those differences with the Boeing Airbus set of agreements that were reached in the context of that summit. But it's also about writing rules for how technology will be regulated, rules for how trade will be governed going forward. And as long as the United States and the European countries are converging, and we've seen a high degree of convergence on this set of issues during the first 5 months of this administration, it will strengthen our hand in dealing with China and anyone else who frankly has a fundamentally different concept for how the international system should work than the nations in the West.
John, I think many of our listeners would be surprised to know the depth of the U.S.-EU security agenda, particularly when it comes to thinking about migration, climate, Africa. That's going to be some of the discussions we're going to have tomorrow throughout this defense forum. And while I just have you here for a few minutes, again, getting back to strategy and priorities, I'd love your thoughts thinking about both Africa, not only the pandemic, but we see climate, we see conflict. How can we work more purposely with our EU colleagues across the board on those challenges?
Absolutely. So in Africa, we see obviously enormous opportunities to engage economically with African economies. Also, really challenges, fundamental security challenges in places like the Sahel, and then increasingly in Ethiopia. And actually, I would point you to the fact that the G7 really elevated the prominence of what is transpiring now in Ethiopia, which has been described as famine, which is described as atrocities being perpetrated. And the G7 actually focusing on that issue, we think was critically important, putting that issue higher up on the international agenda. But I think too often we kind of describe Western engagement, U.S. engagement, European engagement with Africa through primarily a security lens. There are huge economic opportunities, frankly, for both the nations of Africa, but also for the United States and the Europeans in that continent as well. And we are going to be working together to pursue those going forward.
Fantastic. Last word, let's talk a little bit about climate. We saw the White House's climate summit in April. Of course, the G7 focused on this. We're on the road to COP26. The EU has been a climate leader in prioritizing this and seeing it as a national security imperative. Would love your thoughts on, again, climate as security. We do a lot of focus on the Arctic. I know Secretary Blinken was just in the Arctic region. Help us understand where, again, the EU-U.S. relationship can be a driver on climate security.
Yes, absolutely. And look, there is in many ways no higher priority for all of us in the near and medium term than getting a better approach globally to issues of climate change. This is why President Biden, in his first few months in office, hosted the Climate Leaders Summit. All of our climate work obviously is in service of having a successful conference in Glasgow in the fall and actually increasing the ambition globally of countries in terms of their commitments to reducing emissions. That is what Secretary Kerry, now our special envoy for climate, is traveling all over the world trying to encourage. The United States has put down a new emissions target, an updated emissions target after, frankly, 4 years of not only not focusing on these issues, but in some sense kind of undermining the global efforts on this. We know we've got a big hole to dig out of here, and we are truly committed to leading on this set of issues. I guess the other thing I would say on climate in particular and the Arctic is this shows, frankly, the importance of the EU continuing to engage on security issues. There are certain issues that sort of cross the boundaries of traditional kind of alliance work, obviously the NATO being our foremost transatlantic security institution, and that touch on economic issues, that touch on issues like climate change that don't just confine themselves to simply economic, but are also fundamentally security issues as well. And so making sure that the EU's approach is coordinated to a large extent with NATO on some of these things. And cyber is another one of these areas that has an economic dimension, has a security dimension, underscores sort of the importance of making sure that there is security work going on in the context of the EU, which has developed significantly in recent years, but also that's coordinated closely with NATO. You know, the Arctic, as you say, is an increasing area of security concern and even competition with the increased Russian and Chinese presence, but it's also fundamentally about an area in which we are focused on the climate dimension, focused on the economic dimension. All of this has to be integrated in our approach.
Well, John, not only did we just go through the agenda for the EU-Washington Defense Forum, that we're going to dive deeply into all of those issues, but you've really given us a fantastic overview of the breadth and depth of the U.S.-EU security and defense agenda. We love this allied-centric approach. It's really giving us a boost to the work and research that we are doing. So thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule with a very complex global challenges ahead of us, and we look forward to continuing our conversation throughout the Defense Forum. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Heather. Good luck with the rest of this event.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather and Mr. Feiner, for giving us things to think about. You are watching the 10th Annual EU Defense Washington Forum, and it has been underlined already that our security environment is increasingly complex and multifaceted. As new technologies emerge around the world, security challenges are increasingly unconventional. Coming up next, our first panel discussion on hybrid challenges Russia presents to both the European Union and the United States. Cybersecurity threats, disinformation campaigns, money laundering and illicit finance, to name a few. Only recently, the SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline attacks made headlines in the news. We will hear now from a great panel on these issues. Teija Tiilikainen, Director of the European Centre of Excellence on Hybrid Threats, Christopher Robinson is a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the United States State Department, and Jonatan Vseviov is the State Secretary of the Estonian Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This conversation will be led by the national security reporter for the New York Times, Julian Barnes. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thanks for having all of us here. I'm going to start with Mr. Robinson, and I want you to talk to us a little bit about what the best way forward for the U.S. to respond to the threat. I mean, I want you to talk a little bit about how you see this threat from Russia and what the Biden administration should, how it should talk about it.
Great. Well, Julian, thank you very much. And I want to thank the organizers for this. It's a great panel. I'm really honored to be with my colleagues on the panel here. It's very good to see Ambassador Vseviov again in particular. We miss him in Washington. But thank you for getting this together. And I think it's a great way to start the conversation today is to talk about both the hybrid threat and then what do we do about it. And so let's just start with, I think, a fundamental principle that is really we need to establish and understand on how we approach it. And that Russia has shown through its aggressive actions that it rejects the post-Cold War order. And Russia's ongoing aggression in eastern Ukraine, its dangerous and ongoing concentration of forces along Ukrainians' borders, its seizure of Crimea, the blocking of innocent passage, as we just saw in the previous days, its continuing occupation of Georgian territory, extraterritorial assassinations and poisoning, complex disinformation campaigns, as was already touched upon, are all designed to erode trust in democratic systems and to really undermine the trust in these values, the systems we've built, the architecture we've built to promote and defend these systems. And so this threat goes beyond just a traditional military campaign like we saw in Ukraine, but really now encompasses a hybrid suite, a suite of hybrid tools that are used to gain influence and perpetuate instability. We see the long-term challenge here of targeting national security, political stability, social cohesion, economic prosperity among the United States, our NATO allies, and Russia's other perceived enemies, if you will. And again, Moscow trying to shape and perceive public attitudes and public perceptions and weaken confidence in our values. And so we've seen this toolkit grow from both official tactics with economic manipulation, front groups, conducting directed, targeted assassinations, coup attempts, and sabotage, and carried out and sometimes by intelligence companies or intelligence agencies, as well as non-official influence actors such as oligarchs and organized crime groups, as we saw with ransomware attacks, and even NGOs and other front groups that may operate without the direct control by the Kremlin, but really carry out and advance the Kremlin's objectives. And again, if we go back and look at the COVID period, we've seen this in a multiple range from COVID disinformation to undermining faith and trust in the efficacy of Western vaccines, to accusations that the disease or the pandemic was created by the West on purpose. But what do we do about it, Julian, was the next question. So let me just lay out a couple thoughts because I want to leave enough time that we can get through our panel and get to some questions. Is that first, the President Biden and Putin met in Geneva a couple weeks ago, where the President Biden underscored that the U.S. values and U.S. interests that underpin our policy towards Russia. And on one hand, we're clear that we want a stable and predictable relationship with Moscow. We're open to dialogue where that is in our interest, and that was in part the objective of the summit. But another important point was made through the summit, and that is that Russia must cease its destabilizing and dangerous hybrid activities. And so we've made clear that we will take action where Russia threatens our interests and those of our allies and partners. Hybrid threats are an area where there continues to need to be, and there will be, a U.S. response. I think the way we structured that summit, that it was following G7, the U.S.-EU summit, and then the NATO summit, all were a strong signal that the United States values our partnerships and our alliances. And so we really must figure out how to work together better to defend the international rules and the norms against hybrid threats. So let me just lay out a couple points here, is that going forward, I think we really need to strengthen our efforts first to defend against malign influence. And this can be from everything from counter-corruption and addressing beneficial ownership to improving election security. But honestly, defense is not enough. Second, we need to disrupt Russian activities. For example, it's critically important to call out countries that engage in malign and destabilizing activity and publicly attribute those actions. It really undermines the efficacy of those efforts and the standing of any country that attempts to carry it out. And then finally, and I think this needs to be the way to build forward, which is we need a stronger transatlantic approach to deterring future Russian malign influence efforts. Moscow must understand that it cannot succeed, it cannot advance its interests, nor have that stable and predictable relationship with the West if it continues to pursue dangerous and malign activities. In March and April, we started a process to build on those three principles, where we took action to respond to Russia's previous hybrid threats. We included sanctions and expulsions and other measures regarding Russia's use of a chemical weapon in the attempted murder of Alexei Navalny, the SolarWinds cyber intrusion, and Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2020 U.S. presidential elections. These steps all advance all three of those objectives of defending, disrupting, and then we hope deterring future malign activities. And again, transatlantic work, including with the Navalny response, were a good example of how we can work together to counter Russia's willingness to violate international rules and norms. And then finally, maybe one last thought is that the United States and our partners and allies really need to continue to work together to advance the principle that we have a better democratic alternative to these authoritarian governments. And so let me stop there, and then we can get into questions.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Seviov, you're now back in Estonia as the permanent secretary for the Foreign Ministry. You're back on the front lines of Russia's hybrid operations. Talk to us a little bit about how you see the landscape, why Russia remains a threat to the Baltic states, to the region. Talk to us a little bit.
Thank you, Julian. Great to see old friends. Christopher, how are you? I miss Washington. Glad to hear that Washington misses me. I hope that's true. Look, before I address the subject, just thank the organizers, friend Ambassador Lambrinidis, CSIS, obviously, for bringing us together. What a pleasure it is to discuss security in a transatlantic setting. When I left my previous job in Washington, people asked me what I miss American affairs, and my stump answer is that no, because for us here in Estonia, transatlantic relations is not just an important element of our foreign policy, it is our foreign policy. So I am as engaged in these matters today as ambassador in Washington, D.C. President Biden has called America an idea. I want to add to this that Europe, too, is an idea. The core principles of democracy, these notions of individual liberty, human rights, political rights, economic freedom, free market economies, we share them. They're as much European ideas as they are American ideas. It is, however, important to recognize that there are other models out there, fundamentally different ones. And Russia happens to represent one of those different models. It's not just that the model that Russia pursues is different. It is that it pursues it in an aggressive manner. So much so that when NATO heads of state and government met not too long ago in Brussels, they declared that Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to the Euro-Atlantic security. We obviously here in Estonia stand by that statement. We feel it every day. It is, however, important to underline that when it comes to hybrid security concerns, geography matters less. It almost does not matter. So when it comes to cyber attacks or intrusions into elections or propaganda activities, we are in the Baltic states no more, no less affected than allies further from the Baltic Sea. Our elections, interestingly enough, have not been interfered in. We did become targets of the world's first major cyber attacks in 2007. But since those days, I think it's hard to find allies for European Union member states whose critical information systems have not come under attack, at least probing attacks. So geography matters less. The fact that we're right next door is not as significant as people sometimes assume. When it comes to conventional challenges, though, geography still matters. And we are in the Baltic states the only major region of the alliance where the West does not enjoy local military superiority. So yes, obviously we are affected. We're affected first. If you want to call us a canary in the coal mine, you can. But fundamentally, Baltic security is European security, and that equals Euro-Atlantic security. What is to be done? I think when it comes to hybrid scenarios, it is critically important to recognize that it is not the computer that attacks us. There's a human being with flesh and bone behind these decisions. If we are to succeed, then we need to make sure that we address the cost-benefit analysis of the human being behind these activities. Let's not overcomplicate the matters. We need to make clear that we attribute every attack and that there are costs attached to conducting attacks against Western countries. In short, what ought to be done? I'll be very, very blunt and very, very short so that we can save time for questions. We should hold steady. We should not panic. We should maintain Western unity. We should maintain an effective defense and deterrence posture. And we should engage where progress is realistically possible. If we hold steady in this matter, there is no doubt in my mind that we will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Director Tillikainen, can you tell us a little bit, set the broader context here? You've long studied Russian hybrid techniques. Why is Russia using this approach? Why does it operate in the gray zone? Talk to us a little bit about
that. I would argue that we need to understand Russian hybrid threat activity as a part of the broader Russian revisionist foreign policy. So what we can argue is that in the current great power rivalry, Russia is inherently a weak power. It is a weak power that tries to get back to the global position it used to have during the Soviet era and also earlier. So with limited resources, it has to use the toolbox it has available, and that toolbox more or less consists of military might and these hybrid threat instruments that we are discussing here. And the challenge, of course, with these instruments that have been described and mentioned by previous speakers is that they, in comparison with military instruments or with any other political diplomatic instruments, these instruments are highly cost efficient. There is no need to have great resources to be able to exert cyber threat activity or disinformation campaigns. So this is the toolbox: military instruments and the hybrid threat toolbox. I would like to add a couple of things to what has been said already about the set of hybrid threat instruments Russia is using. So we are talking about highly unconventional means. We are talking about means where the target is the whole society and where Russia is operating below the threshold of detection and attribution, as was mentioned. So why does it do this? Why does it want to operate below the threshold of attribution? Because it wants to avoid any type of reaction or countermeasures. And this is, of course, what we need to keep in mind when we think about how to respond and how to prepare ourselves for Russian hybrid threat activity. So it is utilizing the vulnerabilities of our societies, of our governmental systems, our values, and turning these vulnerabilities against us and our security. It is covering its operations with huge information campaigns, partly to justify them to its own domestic audiences, but partly to sow distrust within Western societies. So this whole package is something which I argue by means of which it tries to turn the obvious power asymmetry to its own benefit. So to conclude, to be able to be strong and achieve the position in the global power setup that Russia wants to do, it has to decisively weaken the others. And it has to weaken the factors and pillars on which the strength of its competitors is based upon. So this is the Russian philosophy. And that's why it wants to discredit the Western liberal democracy and the unity of the European Union or the broader transatlantic community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Director. I want to broaden this out to the panel now. Ransomware is one of the latest and most serious threats. Criminal groups harbored by Russia apparently launched a ransomware attack in the United States that shut down a gas pipeline, cutting off gasoline to the East Coast of the United States. Is this something that we should look at as a hybrid attack or a hybrid threat? And beyond sort of wagging our fingers, what should the United States, what should the NATO, the European Union, what should the West do? Director, I want to start with you on that. Ransomware, is that a kind of hybrid attack?
It's a part of the cyber threat toolbox that Russia and also other adversaries are using. It is a very cost-efficient toolbox to be used because attribution, as we know, is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to put a price on this kind of an activity, and still this is exactly what we should do. Later on, I hope in this panel we will talk more about how to deter cyber threats as well as hybrid threats more broadly. But cyber realm, I think, is a very challenging one, exactly because it is so difficult to know who is behind, to be sure who is behind all this. And also perhaps at this stage it should be pointed out that Russia more and more uses non-state actors, kind of proxy actors behind criminal activities of this kind, not to be attributed as it itself. So yes, to be taken very seriously.
Ambassador, if we cannot attribute an attack, if we cannot directly connect a cyber criminal group that is operating inside Russia to the Russian government, should we still react? Should we still do something? And if so, what is the range of options as you see it?
Well, that's the critical question, isn't it? I just want to re-emphasize the importance of attribution. There can be no deterrence without attribution. So everything has to start with attribution, and for that to function, we need to get much better at information exchange between both within the European Union as well as between the European Union and NATO. I think we can do it. We should not overcomplicate it. Sometimes there are attribution difficulties even when it comes to conventional attacks. Remember the early phases of the annexation of Crimea. Back then, a number of media outlets had a hard time calling it what it was. And yet, what we had was boots on the ground, actual military forces with no Union insignia on their shoulders. So attribution oftentimes, or difficulty to attribute, has to do with our own processes. We need to get better at this. And then obviously for deterrence to function, we need to establish clear red lines. We need to maintain open channels of communication. We need to have means at our capacity to respond if necessary, so that we could effect the cost-benefit analysis of the human being that's behind the attack. That is the key. If we overcomplicate this, then we get stuck on point one, which is attribution. We don't just want to defend, we want to deter. We want to make sure that the other side does not consider these as useful tools to be used against us. And a lot here depends on our ability to maintain unity within the Western world, within the European Union and NATO. The more united we are in our responses, both in terms of attribution as well as actual responses, the better off we will be. This will take time because this is a new domain. It is, whether we want it or not, technologically complicated. But for as long as we make progress, increase dialogue within the European Union and between NATO and the European Union on these subjects, I think we're on the right track. I remember back to 2007 when we were cyber attacked. Back then, we had a hard time having our friends and allies in other capitals even understanding what was going on because cyber was such a new development. We are in no such place today. There's a cyber security center of excellence that NATO established in Tallinn, hybrid center of excellence in Helsinki. We're doing a lot of good work on this. So I think we're on the right track. And the main thing is not to overcomplicate this. It is another function of state-on-state relations.
Thank you. Chris, what do you think? Should we think of the ransomware attacks in the same way as the sort of range of hybrid threats from Russia? And what do you think the next steps for the United States to stop this kind of activity is?
So I think one of the important points here is ransomware, even if it's carried out by a private actor, such as in the case of, let's say, the Colonial Pipeline attack. All types of, like any other hybrid activity, it runs the risk of escalation. And that's one of the points we made very clear to the Russian government. And you heard the president speak publicly about this, is that we view these 16 areas of critical infrastructure as specifically not just off limits, but that the response, if there is a cyber incident involving those, that our response will be significant. So what we've tried to do is, one, first, I think Jonathan is exactly right on the importance of attribution. And we've made a lot of progress from the earlier incident in 2007 to, let's just go back over the previous couple of years, from the NotPetya cyber attack, the hacking of the OPCW, the cyber attack on Georgia a couple years ago, and then most recently SolarWinds. The transatlantic community has made a lot of progress in attributing those types of activities to the Russian government. With ransomware, I think the point is that we hold Russia responsible, that there are, if an attack or an incident emanates from Russia's territory, then the Russian government has a responsibility to act here. And we will hold them to account on that. We obviously have a range of tools to do so. There's been some positive comments so far from the Russian government about that they acknowledge this as a problem and that there is a Russian government responsibility, not just to hold accountable, but to prevent future attacks. So both with dialogue and communicating red lines and clear concerns here and the risks of escalation, working as a transatlantic community to identify these and attribute incidents when they occur, and then really working on deterrence as a way forward and making sure we have the tools arrayed to take action when that's required, I think can help us have an effective policy going forward.
Taya, the ambassador spoke about attribution, the need to share information. How are we doing a good job? Is the United States sharing enough information with Europe? Is Europe sharing enough information with the United States? What's the state of play in terms of intelligence sharing, information sharing when it comes to hybrid attacks, when it comes to cyber attacks?
I'm not an insider here, but on the basis of what I know, I think cooperation has been improved, and we all understand that if the adversary wants to weaken our unity, wants to sow distrust also within the European Union and the transatlantic community between our allies and member states, we need to show unity and resolve to counter that. That's the best tool, not to let ourselves be weakened in that way. So from that point of view, sharing of information, sharing the same situational awareness about what's going on, what the adversary's goals are very essential to our security. I would also like to mention, even if we didn't talk that much yet about the relationship between Russia and China, that even if we talk about Russia here, it is very much China that is looming behind, because Russia is doing these things in Europe with the support of China. China tying the U.S. resources elsewhere, and that's I think a part of their strategy to create this unity also in geopolitical terms, giving more room for maneuver to Russia to operate in Europe. So the more we can cooperate, the more we can share our situational awareness, the better equipped we are against the Chinese-Russian threats.
Chris, will you react to that? Will you talk a little bit about how the United States sees the ties between Russia and China when it comes to hybrid operations?
Well, I think that is the Russia-China relationship is one that there's an enormous amount of discussion, I think, perpetually in Washington. And I think there's some real areas to be concerned about, closer intelligence and defense cooperation. And then I think there's always some counterweights to that of historical disagreements between the two. I note that over the weekend, both Moscow and Beijing announced continuing and deepening their strategic partnership. But neither have allies and deep partnerships like we do in the transatlantic community. And so I think both with the strength of our values, our cooperation together in the transatlantic space, and then the architecture that we've built to sustain and promote those values, I think we have a lot of advantages in doing that. But I do think, as Dr. Tiilikainen just touched upon, is how Russia is aggressively using these with the belief through proxy forces like Wagner or subterfuge and disinformation campaigns that it can get away with it. And so if we want to think about the long-term efforts of other state actors potentially picking up some of these tools, I think it's important that we continue to work together to counter and address Russian-specific hybrid and malign influence activities so that we can discourage and deter their use by other actors over the long term. And again, from Dr. Tiilikainen's great position at the Helsinki Center of Excellence, Jonathan already touched upon NATO Centers of Excellence, that we've built up a really strong network of coordination and cooperation on addressing these, and I think really provide strong footing to take that forward.
Ambassador, we raised the issue of deterrence, deterring actions that are calculated to be in the gray zone, that are calculated to be below the threshold of armed conflict, is sometimes difficult. Is it possible? And if so, what are the first steps to deterring this sort of Russian hybrid operations that touch such a range of activities from, overt war to election interference?
Well, Julian, the first thing is attribution, and that takes us back to information exchange. We're often too narrow-minded when talking about information exchange. We focus on what our intelligence agencies do, foreign ministries, defense ministers do. That all is important and should be improved. But a totally different aspect of this is political. The strategic level exercises that we conduct that are aimed at training our leaders to think through the possibilities, scenarios that may not have happened yet, but might confront us in the future. The coordination of policies. forward-thinking discussions on the what ifs. What if X, Y, or Z happens to happen, and what our response should be then. In all of this, it is critical to maintain Euro-Atlantic unity. And to a large extent, we can use NATO for this. NATO is not just a military alliance, it is an organization that has a very significant political dimension. But we should also increase the EU-U.S. dialogue, which is one of the reasons why Estonia has promoted more EU-U.S. dialogue on Russia, for instance. Why Estonia has promoted more strategic level exercises, hybrid scenarios. When we held the presidency of the EU Council, we conducted a defense ministers meeting here in Tallinn, European Union defense ministers meeting. That was the first time ever to include a tabletop exercise on a cyber scenario that also, mind you, included the Secretary General of NATO. No exercise is perfect, and we will never be able to foresee the future. But if we think through the hard problems before they actually take place, then we're better off coordinating our policy responses once things happen. And if the last few decades have been given us any idea as to what the future will hold, then things will happen. So let's coordinate. Let's exchange information, yes, between intelligence agencies and foreign ministries. Let's also get better at political coordination, not only with regards to issues that have already happened, but also with regards to issues that might happen, so that we would have a response, a file of response options, if you will, on our desks, not just as the government of Estonia or the government of the United States or the government of this or that European member states, a file of response options that we as the West can then pick and choose from. I think the more we coordinate, the more we exercise, the more credibility our deterrence posture has, even without us actually having to undertake any of the practical activities. At the end of the day, everything starts with attribution.
Director, once a hybrid attack has been attributed, once there has been information sharing and consultation, should there be a counterattack, even if it is in the sort of covert world? Is that something that will increase deterrence against Russian hybrid operations, or is that something that risks escalation? How do you coordinate a kind of real-world response or cyber response to a hybrid attack that has been attributed to Russia? What's your thinking?
When we talk about countermeasures, I think we should also talk. So when we talk about countermeasures and deterrence, we should keep in mind that there are two options that we should both focus on. First, resilience. So we should make sure that our societies can tolerate a certain level of hybrid threat activity. The more we can tolerate, the less of an effect do these measures have. So resilience is important, and that's also a field where we can support each other in the European Union and between the EU and NATO. So construction of resilience is something I want to point out here. And then to your question, the other part of deterrence is the more proactive measures that we can take, be it sanctions, be it any other form of active measures where we put a price on the adversarial behavior. Here also, yes, I think we should have preparedness to do that, as both the EU and NATO have signaled, for instance, that cyber attacks will be dealt with as any other forms of aggression against them. So this effective signaling is already important. But of course, if the adversary starts testing our willingness to do things, we should have a preparedness to punish. But your question was exactly the right one. So how far can we go without such an escalation that becomes harmful for us and the entire security of our region? That's exactly $100 question, which we should all together think about. But I think effective strategic communication, showing unity and resolve, willingness to support each other, and in a first case scenario also exert some countermeasures. That those all together form an important package.
Chris, talk to us a little bit more about hybrid deterrence and if it is possible, and whether the United States has to do everything in the realm of the seen, or if there can be deterrence of hybrid activities by the unseen operations.
Sure. So, Julian, I think you started off the question right, and there is the risk of escalation, but I think that's really one of the founding points here, is that we have to communicate exactly that to Moscow, is that for Moscow, hybrid actions are not without cost, and they do incur the cost of escalation in addition to the other consequences we might impose. And so I think the very first step then becomes clear communication to Moscow of consequences and the risks that their actions involve. And I think there's a lot that's been done on that. I think the second point, Julian, to get to your question, is about making sure we have a range of tools in the tool basket, because we may, depending on the incident, we're very focused in the discussion today on cyber, but we've seen destructive disinformation campaigns, election interference campaigns, to targeted assassination attempts that actually end up taking the lives of innocent civilians. So there are a range of hybrid activities that we seek to counter and deter, and we need to make sure we have the range of tools in our toolbox. The administration just updated our tools with a new executive order that enables us to employ a new range of sanctions activities, and we demonstrated that capability by sanctioning Russian sovereign debt. I'd note that the EU has new sanction authorities that they have developed over the past several years, from cyber authorities to chemical weapons authorities, and more recently, human rights authorities, to help strengthen our transatlantic toolbox to both counter and ultimately deter. And then I think the last point then is about the credibility and consistency of applying those tools. We may have to choose a range or a mixture of tools depending on the incident, but we have to build up that deterrence over time. It's not as if one response, the response to Navalny, will stop and change the course of behavior from Moscow. And their intention, as Dr. Tellikainen talked about, their increasing reliance on hybrid to carry out their activities. This is a continuum. We need, as the transatlantic community, to consistently and credibly apply a range of those tools, from the seen to the unseen, to achieve deterrence with Moscow in the hybrid space.
Ambassador, communicating with Moscow has been a controversial subject in Europe in recent days. France and Germany advanced a proposal for another summit, for a summit with Putin, something that the former president of Estonia reacted quite negatively toward. The Baltic states had a lot of block that. What do you think? How should Europe communicate with Putin? And could direct communication be part of anti-hybrid operations strategy?
Well, thank you, Julian. Absolutely. Communications are important, peer communications especially. Before answering the question, let me just underline the point that Christopher made on the importance of consistency. We need to apply the tools that we have developed consistently. Otherwise, we risk it creating confusion. Even though constructive ambiguity can be an important part of our strategy, an important part of our deterrence strategy, then the stress here is on the word constructive. And not every ambiguity is constructive. And consistency is critically important, especially because of the fact that we need to demonstrate unity. If a particular ally is attacked and we respond in a certain way, then a few years later another ally is attacked and we respond in a fundamentally different way, then we risk creating confusion. And that is not constructive ambiguity. Now, when it comes to dialogue, we're absolutely for it. We have never been opposed to dialogue. The President visited Moscow not too long ago for talks with President Putin. We have not been the ones that said no to dialogue. It is more often the Russian side that has said no to dialogue. When it comes to dialogue on the strategic level, we believe that it should have clearly defined and realistic substantive goals, and that we should remain united when pursuing it. The fact that we are united is one of the most important elements of our strength. We need consensus in the European Union, and I am happy to note that there was consensus at the European Union. You need to look for consensus not at the beginning of the meeting, but at the end of the meeting. So it's absolutely natural that different member states arrive at the table with different ideas and perspectives. That's why we have these meetings. We discuss and debate. These are not mid-level officials doing the discussing and debating. These are prime ministers and presidents. At the end of the meeting, we had consensus again. This is how the European Union functions. And we've been absolutely clear as the European Union that our policy on Russia is based on the 5 principles, has been for years now. And that for there to be fundamental change in our approach to Russia, there needs to be fundamental change in the way Russia approaches European security, be it in Ukraine, in Georgia, or vis-a-vis European Union member states and NATO allies themselves. We have not seen substantive positive change from Russia. And hence, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Let's not panic and let's hold steady. That's what our policies should be. And we're very happy and satisfied with the results of the last European Council meeting, as well as we're happy with the results of the last NATO summit. Both of these texts that came out of these meetings on Russia correspond directly to Estonia's perspectives on Russia. I think we've demonstrated unity and cohesion, and we shouldn't get carried away by looking at all the different potential proposals that people come up with and the press stories that they generate. We're united. That's the main thing.
Director Tilley-King, is Russia becoming less effective at some of these hybrid attacks? I'm thinking of the misinformation campaigns around COVID or in some of the recent elections. This seemed to have, if we rewind 4 years, a fairly big impact, perhaps. But are European and American publics becoming more resilient, more suspicious, that more wary of Russian disinformation? Is this hybrid operation becoming less effective? What's your thinking?
Yes, I think to some extent we have learned in the West. We have learned and created our toolbox and enhanced our resilience. So to some extent, perhaps the old instruments are less effective now. But I must say that at the same time, there are new instruments popping up all the time. So the game is not over. If you think about the Russian activity in North Africa, in the broader Middle East, we see hybrid threat potential emerging. How will it look like in the Arctic within the next few years? What kinds of threat activity do we see there? So unfortunately, the answer has to be that they haven't used the entire toolbox yet. There seems to be rather new instruments popping up when we learn how to cope with the existing ones or older ones. But luckily, I would like to stress that we seem to have learned a lot about how to prevent interference in elections. At least these results are moving to a good direction, even if there are still a lot of challenges. We talk about the role of the social media platforms and try to do our best to counter this phenomenon. That goes straight to the heart of our democracy, of course.
Thank you much. We have only about a minute left. Chris, I'm going to give you the last question, which is, the Biden administration has thought more about more creatively about sanctions with the sovereign debt actions, but some critics have said that the actions of Europe and the United States are not direct enough to Vladimir Putin, and that if we went after his wealth, held by oligarchs, we'd have it would be more impactful. Is that on the table? What are the roadblocks to doing that? What is the sanctions future?
So I think when you look at the executive order, we demonstrated that we will look at the range of Russia's malign activities and aggression abroad, and we're ready to use sanctions against as one of the responses to that. And that's everything from elections interference to cyber to human rights to Russia's use of energy as a weapon. So, of course, Moscow's reliance on oligarchs, that always remains part of the option. But I think, as you've heard consistently from the panel today, it's the importance also of transatlantic unity and response. And our sanctions are most effective when we work together as a transatlantic community, including the U.S. and the EU. And our responses on Ukraine, Crimea, and Navalny are good examples on that front, and we hope to continue that.
And thank you to the whole panel. We had a great discussion, and back over to you.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you to all our panelists. As you heard in this discussion of Russia, China was focused very prominently, and our next discussion will be on China. But before this discussion, we will have a short pause so you can stretch, have a little coffee, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our 10th annual EU-Washington Defense Forum. From Russia, we will move now to China. China's continual race on the global stage provides new challenges as well as opportunities for cooperation with the EU, the US, and for the rest of the world. Now, a conversation on how the European Union and the United States can find common ground in addressing these challenges is Senior Fellow for Asian Security and Director of the China Power Project at the CSIS, Ms. Bonnie Lin, joined by Gunnar Vigeland, Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific for the European External Action Service, and Mikko Huuttari, Executive Director at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, and Laura Rosenberger, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council, the White House. Over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am very delighted and honored to be on such an amazing panel with experts from the United States as well as the European Union. I wanted to open up the discussion by offering each of our panelists an opportunity for brief opening remarks. And in particular, I want our panelists to provide some opening comments on how, from their perspective, the United States or Europe views the China challenge, or do do countries on either side view China as a potential threat? So let me turn to Mr. Wiegand first, and then we'll go to Laura, Ms. Rosenberger, and then go to Dr. Huuttari. So Mr. Wiegand.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you for the Defense Forum for having me with you. I think the degree of convergence of views has never been higher than now. Just look at the EU-U.S. summit, which just took place. I quote to you one sentence: "We intend to closely consult and cooperate on the full range of issues in the framework of our respective, similar, multifaceted approaches to China, which include elements of cooperation, competition, and systemic rivalry." That sentence would have been impossible during the previous administration. That sentence was not looked for during the administration previous to the previous administration. So the fact that we are looking at China both as a partner for cooperation on many important global and regional challenges, the fact that we clearly identify China as a key competitor, notably when it comes to the critical competition for the new technologies which will determine the economies and society, that we see very strong elements of systemic rivalry which stems from the fact that we are different systems. That is something which binds us together in transatlantic unity and gives us more opportunities to work together. And that kind of approach we are following since 2019 in the European Union, and that also provides us with unity inside the European Union, which allows us to work more together with like-minded partners. This approach has been also reflected in different ways, but in a similar direction at the G7 as well as at the NATO summit. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me turn to Ms. Rosenberger for her perspective, and particularly from the U.S. perspective. Is China just merely a security challenge, or is China a security threat?
Well, thanks so much, Bonnie and Gunnar. It's great to be with you, and Mikko, great to be with you as well. I think that what Gunnar pointed to as convergence can also be illustrated in the degree to which he basically stole my opening remarks. No, I'm kidding, but I honestly think I practically could have said everything that he just said, and it really shows the degree to which we are singing from the same song sheet. Let me just actually elaborate a little bit on some of the points of convergence that Gunnar sort of ran through from the US-EU summit, as well as from the G7 conversations and the NATO summit, because I think it's illustrative of the ways in which both the United States and Europe are conceiving of the challenge that we face. First of all, in addition to that
really powerful sentence that Gunnar noted. In the U.S.-EU summit statement, we talked about concerns about China's human rights abuses. We talked about concerns about activities in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, freedom of navigation, cross-strait stability, the importance of the Indo-Pacific region. We importantly agreed to form a Trade and Tech Council to ensure that the United States, Europe, and other like-minded democracies are the ones that are writing the rules for the future of new and emerging critical technologies, which, as Gunnar mentioned, are a key space for competition. We agreed to work together on supply chain resilience, again, to ensure that we have both secure and sustainable supply chains. We've also talked about coercive economic practices from China and the degree to which we need to both be coming together to address some of our own transatlantic challenges to better align to address the coercive economic practices that we face from China. So I think across these areas, what we see is both the alignment, as Gunnar pointed to, on the systemic nature of the challenge, the different systems between, the president has talked quite a bit about the competition between democracies and autocracies and the need for democracies to show that they deliver. And I think that points to a really important piece of what certainly the United States is trying to do in the competition with China. And that is actually to rally the world's democracies and many of our other partners to provide an affirmative offer that is different than what China is offering, that is consistent with the international rules-based order, that provides for a foundation for people to best realize themselves. And it shows that we believe we will be more effective when we stand together. We know, for instance, that China has a long history of trying to divide allies, trying to divide the United States and Europe, trying to divide Europe from within itself through a number of different tactics. And I think the more we can demonstrate that we are actually standing with one another, the more effective we will be in showing that democracies are bringing something to the table, are actually proving that for their people at home as well as for the world that they are delivering. Let me just spend a minute then, Bonnie, on what you asked about in terms of the way we think about the challenge. And I think, it is multifaceted, as we said in the statement, but we see that across the board, China is challenging key tenets of the international rules-based order. And that is, in fact, a threat to the United States and to the system that we have worked so hard with our European partners over the last decades to build and sustain. Whether it's in the security, or whether it's in the cyber domain, whether it's China's military modernization and expansion, including its rapid nuclear expansion, whether it's its militarization of the South China Sea, whether it's its aggressive or coercive activities across the Taiwan Strait, these are all, I think, really key challenges that we face that are of great concern, not just to the United States, but to many of our allies around the world, including, as we saw in the statement, in Europe. But I think that, security today means, many things beyond just the military space. And so having secure supply chains, having technologies that are consistent with democracy, that are going to allow for a future that is, consistent with the rules-based order that we've had. These are all, I think, key pieces of the security challenge that we face. So let me pause there. I could go on, I think, a good bit longer, but I look forward to the dialogue with everyone on the panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Laura. That was a really, really great recap of a lot of different challenges that China poses, not only to the United States, but also to the European Union. Let me now turn to Dr. Huhtari. If you could maybe add on to what Laura and Gunnar have already mentioned and highlight where, even though China poses a range of challenges to countries in Europe, where you might see some of the differences. So, for example, does China pose more or less of a cyber threat to different countries, or does China pose more of a threat in terms of military threat to other countries? Could you just highlight from your perspective what you see as some of the differences across Europe in terms of perceiving of China as a security challenge?
Thank you, Bonnie. My absolute pleasure to be on this panel here with colleagues. Let me just start by saying that I find it extremely important to state that this is not an artificial consensus, because it's rooted in our understanding of the trajectory of China, of China's global behavior, and an understanding of our respective bilateral relationships and how they have developed. So this is nothing that will go away easily, and I think it's something to build on. In terms of the differences and different perceptions, it's quite clear that countries in the European Union, but also across the Atlantic, are affected in different ways and different means. Our interdependence is different with regard to the main economic interactions, but also the strategic landscape that we're each operating in. But despite the fact that I would still posit that the European Union has a different strategic outlook on China's rise that is not so much driven by an understanding of and the need to be globally preponderant. But at the same time, as colleagues have spoken out quite clearly and said it quite clearly, we see the same challenge, and the same challenge is the challenge to the international order. And this is what unites us, maybe despite the different perspectives on the overarching strategic challenges and even specific effectiveness being quite different.
Thank you very much. Let me now turn from the general discussion of the challenge that China poses to more of how the United States and Europe could work closer together. And let me turn first back to Laura to provide some thoughts from, at least from the U.S. side. What do you want? What do you see as sort of the next steps? We already accomplished quite a bit, as you mentioned, in the recent summit. But what do you see as next steps, and what do you see as we could do more of? What do you see as the United States could do more of, and what do you see as we might ask our European counterparts to do more of?
Thanks, Bonnie. So I think, first of all, I just want to point to a really important point that Miko raised, which is the degree to which this alignment is sorry, there was some background noise there. So the degree to which I think this convergence is in part driven by China's own behavior. And certainly that's what's driving the United States concerns and I think driving many of the concerns in Europe as well. In terms of next steps, the way I see it is, over the past 5 months of the Biden administration, we've spent a tremendous amount of time talking with our allies across the Atlantic, seeking areas where we see alignment and really identifying them in the quite clear terms that we talked about earlier with, in the various statements from the president's trip to Europe. I think now the important piece of work for us is to put some more meat on the bones and to define some of the practical areas of cooperation where we want to be working together. So, for instance, on the commitments at the G7 on forced labor, we identified several specific sectors where we believe, we should be working to address and take steps to ensure that our supply chains are free from forced labor. The United States took some subsequent steps last week with respect to the polysilicon industry from Xinjiang, and we look forward to working with our allies in Europe on additional steps that we can take together in more practical terms to make good on that commitment. Similarly, on the Trade and Tech Council, I think it's a really important step that we have formed that together. Was a proposal originally from the European Union, which we welcomed. And I think it's going to be a really important space for us to be able to, across the range of trade and technology issues, figure out how we can best align our own visions and our own approaches and advance international standards and rules and norms that are consistent with the kind of technological space and economic space that we think is going to be consistent with the rules-based order and the future that we seek. And so I think that across a range of those issues, there's a number of additional steps to be taken to fill out, beneath the conceptual agreement that we have, some of the practical steps will be taken together. Last thing I'd say, though, is I think there was a really important reference in the EU-U.S. summit statement on the important role of the Indo-Pacific and maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think we certainly welcome and think it's really important Europe's increasing interest in and engagement with the Indo-Pacific region itself, because I think a lot of the work the United States is doing is not just trying to be, our view is that geographic boundaries, when we're talking about competition that is on technological fronts, economic fronts, that it's not necessarily bounded geographically. And so being able to forge different linkages and alignment across different parts of the world, I think, is also going to be really, really important.
Thank you, Laura. Let me pull on this last thread that you mentioned about the importance of increasing engagement within the Indo-Pacific and being more active in the region. So let me turn to Mr. Wingard, Gunnar, to talk about, as part of your portfolio, you're very much involved in the European Union's activities within the Indo-Pacific, that region. I would love for you to talk about what is the European Union already doing in the region, and in what aspects could you see you're doing more, particularly on the security side. Does that include, for example, more transits of South China Sea? Does that include more military activities in the region, or is it more going to be more concentrated on the cyber, tech and trade domain?
Well, if you allow me, I would like to first comment a little bit before coming to the Indo-Pacific on what Laura set out from the US perspective. Underlining that when we set up an EU-US dialogue on China, which is the first time ever we did this at very senior level, that this would look both at economic, political, security issues, with a focus on reciprocity requirements, on resilience capacity of our societies and economies, on human rights, on security issues, yes, security issues as far as they are dealt with by the European Union. Let's not forget that NATO is the organization where we have the hard security issues much more prominently placed. Also, international organizations, and finally, the different ways of engaging China. And I would also like to recall when you started this session, there was just the Russia session before. A very clear threat from a neighboring country in hard security terms. And when NATO had its summit and for the first time included China in its outcome document, it was that China stated ambitions present systemic challenges to the rules-based international order and to areas relevant to alliance security. So, challenges. And these challenges are sometimes very much in the security sphere, and I think cybersecurity is here the most relevant for Europe. Cybersecurity in two ways. First, the attacks on cybersecurity, which happen quite frequently, and for the first time last year, Europe imposed sanctions because of cybersecurity behavior of certain actors in China. It happened also against certain actors from Russia and North Korea. But secondly, cybersecurity in terms of what the development of new technologies in the cyberspace mean for our security. And here, of course, the technological race for the artificial intelligence is of particular relevance, and the race for setting new standards in these new technologies. Therefore, the reference for Flora to the Trade and Technology Council is, of course, important because we have had quite a number of differences over the last years between the EU and US on new technologies, on digital issues, and we need to overcome these. There's a clear wish of China to dominate, a stated wish to dominate the development of new technologies in the world. And we see also how this plays out, particularly in the field of semiconductors. So cybersecurity I would place first together with the digital challenge, the artificial intelligence challenge. Linked to that is also the whole range of hybrid threats, which were, again, prominently discussed before in the Russia panel. But we know also significant efforts from the Chinese side, and we depict them in our regular disinformation reviews. I think we are probably the only foreign service in the world which does that regularly. Disinformation and influence operations. And of course, the digital sphere is the sphere where this happens most. I will not talk much about the hard security, but it is an obvious area of concern. The stated ambition of the modernization of the PLA, full-scale modernization by 2035, with a world-class military in terms of the high-tech capacities by 2049. We have annual growth rates of between 7 and 8% of the defense budget, and China is now the second largest spender after the US. This has led to huge new capacities, and the Navy, plus the Coast Guard, plus the what some people call the fisheries militia, make a huge fleet and makes a protection capability. And here I come somehow to your question on the Indo-Pacific, which goes well beyond the waters of China and go fast into the Indo-Pacific, far into the Indo-Pacific area. And freedom of navigation and overflight is, of course, key. This is an artery of the world economy, 40% of our foreign trade South China Sea, and we have therefore significant stakes in this part of the world. So the technology side, the maritime security, and on the other hand, the regional projection. Now, what happens in the South China Sea, what happens in the Taiwan Strait have global repercussions, on supply chains. We recently had one evergreen ship having a major problem over a couple of days in the Suez Canal. We saw which impact it had on our fragile global supply chains. Let me finish by saying that certainly we also would look at China as a partner, and this is much more the worry of colleagues in the classic armament field, but as a partner who should also enter into the global non-proliferation instruments. Recently, good step was taken on the Arms Trade Treaty, but in many other areas, this is not yet the case. We also need to work with China on very concrete challenges. Non-proliferation, Iran. There we work closely with China to contain that challenge. But also when it comes to Afghanistan or when it comes to Myanmar. So I want to give you just this picture that, yes, we work with like-minded partners most and more, but we have many areas where we also have to work together with China to be a responsible stakeholder of that rules-based international order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for painting, I guess, the multifaceted challenge as well as partnership that Europe needs from China in many ways. Let me turn to Miko for any comments from your end, additional thoughts on particularly looking at not only the challenge that China poses, but to what extent does Europe's need to work with China limit the ability of Europe to push back against some of the challenges that China may pose? How does Europe balance the need to both work with China and deal with some of the security challenges that China poses?
Thanks, brilliant question. First of all, I think I should state that this is not a problem that Europe alone faces. It's one that other countries face, including direct neighbors and also the United States in many ways. So this is something that we all have to find a new balance with. It's quite clear that deepening interdependence with China, i.e., our economic footprint, investment footprint in China, creates some additional new challenges these days. So economic security is becoming an issue that is becoming more prominent across the Atlantic, but also with partners in the region. Obviously, managing critical supply chains, as Mr. Wiegand has said earlier, with regard to key and emerging technologies, is an issue that we all jointly face. And I think the next big frontier will be how to manage R&D, research and development in and with China, so the innovation frontier really. And this is where the biggest challenges will lie. How do we define what needs to be done and should be done from a corporate perspective with China, in China, and sometimes also from a global public goods perspective with regard to some of the human challenges that we all face. But what are the limitations? Because many of these technologies will be dual use and multi-purpose. So I think that's a big challenge that we are facing. How do we deal with it? I think it's just the starting point of a long, long conversation that we all need to have in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me turn back to Laura. So Mr. Wiegand, as well as Dr. Hattori, basically laid out sort of the rank order of the challenges from the European side. I know there's a lot of, it's probably really a complex issue when it comes to the United States, but would you put the challenges that China faces roughly in the same order in terms of cyber being the primary challenge, followed by tech and trade, knowing this is, of course, with the caveat that Mr. Wiegand mentioned that he was mainly focusing on the softer challenges that China poses. So, Laura, any comments from your end on if, from the U.S. perspective, is this sort of a same set of challenges that we view from China, or is there a slightly different ranking and stacking, maybe prioritizing more of the hard security questions first, too?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really rich conversation. You won't be surprised that I'm reticent to rank order or prioritize many of these issues that I think are probably too much to really elaborate on in just a few minutes. But what I would say is certainly I agree with the laydown that's been put on the table. Obviously, the United States, does have I think slightly broader set of concerns when it comes to the security front, in part because, as Gunnar rightly mentioned, the EU's competencies on the security side are different, certainly than what we have, what we see from NATO or what the United States is looking at, as well as, of course, obviously individual European nations have, their own security concerns when it comes to China. But I certainly think that from a broad perspective, we see the competition with China basically unfolding across, a range of diplomatic and political spaces, economic spaces, technological spaces, and military spaces. And I think within each of those, there are significant challenges that we do face. And so I would sort of leave it at that, having elaborated a good bit earlier on that. The one thing I would pick up on, though, that I haven't really mentioned yet, but that Gunnar and Miko both mentioned, was where are the areas where we do think we have an interest in cooperating. And certainly, the United States believes that it is in our interest to cooperate with China in certain areas. And the one that really hasn't come up yet today is climate. Where I think that, at the end of the day, China's probably going to act out of its own interests and its own domestic drivers. But I think it's, as with many issues, incredibly important that the United States and its allies and partners and others around the world are able to come together to sort of raise the standard that we are all driving for in the climate space in order to help bring China on board. Because I think that, when we look at the climate perspective and the set of issues there, there's no question that China needs to be part of the solution. And climate change is a really existential issue for the planet. And so we need to make sure that not only are we seeking to cooperate with China on climate issues, and certainly Secretary Kerry has had a very open dialogue with his counterpart, Xie Zhenhua, but that we are also working together to align our positions with respect to China in order to help bring additional pressure to bear to get them on board on really important, commitments to, step up in that space.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, thanks for pointing an issue that we haven't covered, and I'm sure that there are other issues that we haven't touched on yet that are central to the discussion of China. Let me turn to Miko first to either add to your discussion of climate change, or if there are any other issues that you think that are central to how either U.S. or Europe view China that we haven't necessarily discussed.
Thanks. And, being a good European, I think economic issues come first to some extent. So there's a lot of background work that has been done in the past years on jointly working on the economic playing field issues. They are important from a long-term perspective, also from a security perspective. So I think it's absolutely essential. Economic security has been mentioned earlier, working on future-proofing the tech control toolboxes, supply chain security, also mitigating the risk of Chinese economic coercion. These are all fields where we can work together. I'm also missing a debate about the positive agenda. So we need to be competing for tech leadership jointly as much as possible. Ambassador Wiegand said earlier, setting the tech standards together is certainly the way forward. But also, as Laura mentioned, a shared approach to human rights and technology, AI ethics and other issues. These are areas where we really need to come together, how to deal with these joint challenges. But then maybe final point here from my side, providing alternatives on infrastructure and connectivity is an issue that will give us great leverage and also additional potential in working with partners internationally and fulfilling their needs and supporting them with their agendas, I think is absolutely essential. As long as we only talk and don't deliver and provide alternatives, I don't think we'll be able to face the China challenge.
Thank you. Let me pull on one thread before turning it back to Mr. Wiegand. You had mentioned economic dependency, and you had also mentioned integration in your earlier comments. And I know you've written quite a bit on economic decoupling or aspects of that decoupling. Could you talk a little bit about where you see that going and how that and I guess what are your current recommendations given that given the current state of EU-China relations?
If there's an economic and political debate in the United States about decoupling, if there is a debate in China about so-called dual circulation, this could end up with two different spaces of technological development and of standard setting, which would compete. Kind of a new Cold War based on new technologies and on the related standards. And then who can convince more clients in the rest of the world? This is not the European concept. We want to have global standards for all, same rules for all. We want to have China as a responsible stakeholder, as I said before, setting together global standards, not going for special ways and then using the financial liquidity. And Mikko Tuari pointed at connectivity, and we all know the effects of the Belt and Road Initiative. Sounds great, looks great, leads to huge indebtedness. And yes, infrastructure is fast created, but dependency is lasting for many countries. Let me also say that I fully agree with Laura that, of course, there are very important, real global challenges. And the most real one and the most urgent one is climate change, to have real commitments on climate change. We are very glad that the US is back with the Paris Agreement, and that we can work very well with the US, and we can see that when we convince the Japanese and the Koreans and the Indians, we also will manage to convince the Chinese that the only way to go forward is a circular economy way. And this year we have the Glasgow COP26, where all this will need to be expressed in very clear terms. In terms of the economic security, I couldn't agree more with Mikko that a lot has been done lately addressing reciprocity resilience issues from investment screening, where there's a lot of there's an important security dimension in this when it comes to critical infrastructure in Europe, when it comes to high tech and the use of high tech. We have economic coercion legislation coming. We have foreign subsidies legislation, which is being proposed. We have due diligence on human rights and forced labor legislation. We have an international procurement instrument. All these are instruments which either help us to increase resilience and enforce reciprocity in the absence of bilateral or multilateral rules, or which help us to address also challenges with the means we have as the largest internal market of the world and as a normative space. Let me finish by saying that on the Indo-Pacific, the European offer, the European specific contribution is precisely not to come to a situation of confrontation. The great majority of countries in this large space does not want to be split into two camps which oppose each other, but that we want to have a space of cooperation. And we are going to go beyond what our Council of Ministers recently in April decided about this in greater detail with a joint communication coming out of the High Representative and the European Commission in September. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on a point that was mentioned earlier. We had mentioned infrastructure, we had mentioned Belt and Road Initiative. Let me turn to Laura to talk a little bit about sort of what was agreed to in terms of the Build Back Better initiative, and what are some of the other efforts we have underway in order to address this aspect of the China challenge.
Thanks, Bonnie, for that. So I think both Miko and Gunnar are absolutely right on the important infrastructure needs that we see globally. And as mentioned, China has certainly brought its own offer to the table through the Belt and Road Initiative. But we think that it's past time for the United States and many of our like-minded allies to be stepping up to offer something as an alternative that also helps address those really important needs. And I think one of the critical pieces here to just highlight is that this is really about providing something that is an affirmative offer. This is not necessarily seeking to counter something, but is actually recognizing that there are great needs, that we have the ability to help provide for those needs in a higher standard way, in a way that we actually think will, better serve the needs of people around the world, and do so in a way that is consistent with rules of the road, and not come with coercive strings attached. So we were really glad to be able to reach agreement at the G7 on this, and that the U.S. and EU also talked about support for this in the summit statement as well. I think, there's been a number of specific sectors that have been identified as areas where we intend to focus on. And it's definitely something that we're really looking forward to further developing and articulating the plans for that through some of the effort that was formed underneath the G7 process to move out on that. So I think it's just another one of the examples of where, President Biden has reinforced his view that we need to show that democracies deliver and come together to do that. So I think that's something that we're very much looking forward to working together with our partners to further develop.
Thank you, Laura. Mr. Wiegand, you had mentioned the importance of Europe not being finding itself not in the Indo-Pacific, so you're not pulled in like a Cold War like mentality direction. Could you describe a little bit about where you see the risk of that happening with respect to a separation between China and other countries? Is it mainly on the hard security side, or do you also see that on the technology front? Like basically, what security areas do you see that most at risk of, and how is Europe trying to navigate itself to not be in that situation?
Well, first you will appreciate that for Europeans, the notion of Cold War is not an attractive notion, because Europe was deeply divided, split. We had the highest concentration of military power in the world in the middle of our continent. And now we have European Union with a number of member states coming from this former so-called Soviet bloc. So nobody here is interested in going back into that scheme of thinking. But it would be also an intellectual shortcut, I would say, to do this, which may not withstand the test of reality. When you look at the fact that China is, and Miko Tari pointed at this, is a very important economic and that means both trade and investment partner, both for the US as well as for the European Union and many other countries. So there is a degree of economic interdependence which exists, which goes, by the way, of course, both ways. Where would China be? Where would have been the success of China, this rise of China, without the open markets it has found, without the openness of our companies to go and invest and to bring technology to China? So there is a mutual dependency, and one has to be very careful on how to deal with this. I think that if you want to really test me and find out where I find that we are very close to Cold War, well, then I'm afraid that in the cybersecurity field, we are in the middle of it. This is reminding us of past competitive behaviors. And I would add also the growing area of hybrid activities, disinformation activities. So that means with both of these, China, which try to either disrupt our open democratic societies or at least severely influence the public discourse, which social media open to a significant degree in other ways that this would have been ever possible during the Cold War times. So it's a real challenge for our open and liberal democracies to cope with this. And therefore, I'm glad for all colleagues, and we had the Hybrid Center or Fusion Center director before, that there is much more attention paid to this. So cyber, digital space, information, influence operations, there I would say we are unfortunately very close to a Cold War competition. Let me recall that the previous administration has also used a language which was sometimes very close to that Cold War rhetoric and was used at high and highest levels. This is something which we do not want to fuel as Europeans. Lastly, there is one point I would like to add to the previous description when also Laura pointed at our multifaceted approaches. We have been finalizing, and I know not very much to the pleasure of everybody in the United States, negotiations on a comprehensive agreement on investment end of December 2020. And just 3 months later, we have imposed sanctions against China because of the Xinjiang-related human rights violations. Well, both forms part of our multifaceted approach, and we believe that we need to continue with that approach.
Thank you, Mr. Regan. Let me turn to Dr. Hutari to elaborate a little bit more on many of the points that you mentioned. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the specific challenges that China has provided, both on the digital side, the cyber side, and in the disinformation side? Has it disproportionately affected particular countries in Europe, or is this relatively widespread across?
Thanks. I think economic espionage by Chinese actors is pretty widespread across Europe, obviously depending on the industrial profile of different countries, but it's a reality that many countries have faced in the past. The other aspects, hacking attempts, I think is a global phenomenon and really no big difference across countries in the European Union. Everyone is affected by something that goes to the heart of a Microsoft system, the Exchange server, as it has been the case earlier this year. In terms of disinformation and information operations, I think that's a bit more targeted, also depending on the relevance of countries. Certainly Germany is a country where a lot of activities have been registered, but also in the periphery, in other places where China is pursuing specific interests, elite capture, but also working with media is becoming an issue that is quite important to watch carefully, and very happy to see that the European Union is putting so much emphasis on these issues.
Thank you. Laura, I wanted to also turn to you to discuss how disinformation, cyber threat from China, as well as the general digital threat, from your perspective, how that has also impacted either the United States directly or our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. I know you've studied quite a bit on Chinese disinformation.
Thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, definitely a topic that I've spent a good bit of time, including when I was outside of government, thinking about and working on. I think that the challenge we see from China in the information space includes a number of different dimensions. Some of it is around shaping the content of information. I think that's most aptly described in the space of disinformation, although so a lot of what we see Chinese actors engaged in, certainly those that appear to be linked to the government, is not always full-blown disinformation, but is often an attempt to really just reorient parts of the information space. And so it's propaganda, but it's also hiding the hand of the actors that are involved in pushing certain narratives. But we also see China making a big push around its global media presence in ways that are rewriting the rules for how media is able to operate in certain countries. Obviously, freedom of the press is not something that we see in China, and certainly its recent actions in Hong Kong only demonstrate the degree to which China is trying to crack down in those spaces. And then, of course, we see more broadly the way it's trying to design and advance technology platforms that offer a different vision of what the digital information space should look like, what the rules should be there, and on the global stage, trying to advance different concepts of cyber and information sovereignty. So I think it's a really important point that, as far as both when it comes to the challenge to democracy and to international rules, as well as on the security front, a lot of issues for us to contend with in the information space. And Gunnar mentioned the great work that the External Action Service does on these issues. And I think it's really, really important, and certainly stuff that we watch very closely as well.
Thank you, Laura. I'm cognizant that we're almost nearing the end of our panel, so I wanted to go around the room and offer everyone opportunity to offer any closing thoughts or of issues that folks that you should either pay attention to when thinking about the China threat or pay attention to in terms of thinking about U.S.-EU cooperation on countering or dealing with the challenges that China poses. So let me turn to Dr. Utari first, and then Ms. Rosenberger, and then finally Mr. Wiegand. So Mika, over to you first.
Thank you, and I'll try to be very brief. I think it's absolutely essential, and we've reached a good state that we move from rhetoric to action, and the institutional framework that we now have with the Trade and Technology Council, but also the wider and more trusted coordination circles, I think, provide a good platform for that. So as Laura and Gunnar Wiegand have said earlier, it is about providing concrete alternatives and defending what matters to us. I don't think transatlantic cooperation should be geared as constraining China necessarily in what it does, but rather being very convincing and confident in what we need to defend and what our strengths are really.
Thank you. Laura, over to you.
Well, I'll second all of that, and also just pick up on one really brief point that Gunnar mentioned, which is the degree to which the EU's engagement in the Indo-Pacific region is not aimed at in any way seeking conflict, but actually averting it. And I think it's a really important point, because the more that China's leaders understand that the interests, the international interests in the South China Sea, in the Taiwan Strait, are held by many, and that the concerns are not just those of the United States, but are the concerns of many, many countries. I think it both reinforces the degree to which these are challenges to agreed set of rules that we believe should underpin the international system, but also underscore the degree to which that Beijing should think twice about taking actions that would undermine peace and stability, because in fact there are a broader array of interests there than just any one country. And so I think that it's exactly that kind of both engagement and presence as appropriate in the Indo-Pacific region that actually can help reinforce the pillars of peace and stability.
Thank you, Laura. Final remarks from Mr. Wiegand, if you can help us close and wrap up the panel.
Yeah, let me take this up, what Laura just said. I was recently with High Representative Borrell in Indonesia. There was such a strong support for a stronger European presence in that Indo-Pacific space, such an interest for joining up with ASEAN in making sure that the Indo-Pacific does not become a field of hard security confrontation, But in the absence of a security architecture, which is the difference with Europe, it does develop further areas of cooperation where we need to cooperate together, whether it's on ocean governance, on biodiversity, on fisheries, whether this is on the law of the sea, whether this is on promotion of regional integration, and indeed much more trade liberalization, sustainable trade liberalization. These will be all areas where Europe will engage more with partners ranging from the east coast of Africa and India to the Pacific Islands. We will not send fleets to the Indo-Pacific, but we will extend maritime awareness operations, which are done with navies and coast guards currently in the Indian Ocean, to also the Southeast Asian partners, and we will try to identify now so-called enhanced areas of maritime interest where we will have more cooperation between our national navies, which is something which we are trying in other parts of the world currently, and we hope to successfully extend this also to this part of the world where we have critical economic and security interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiegand. Thank you, Dr. Hotari, and thank you, Ms. Rosenberger. We've had such a wonderful discussion. I only wish we had another hour, but in the interest of time, let me pass it back to our host, and thank you again for all your wonderful insights and comments.
Great discussion, and thank you, Pani, for hosting this interesting discussion. But now we'll take another short break before we will go to next big topic, emerging and disruptive technologies, and how the United States and European Union can both develop strategies to deal with those new technologies. See you back here at 20 minutes past the hour, so the break is very short, but we'll be back soon. Welcome back, everyone. This is the 10th annual EU Defense Washington Forum. New technologies emerging daily with rapid advances happening in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and machine learning. Some of them can be disruptive when used in certain ways. What are the security implications of these new technologies, and how well are we prepared in our response against these new threats? Also, who will set the rules and standards for the use of these new technologies? Is there more Europe and the US can do together to foster technological cooperation? Also, how to preserve rules-based international order when it comes to new technologies? Many, many questions. And to provide some answers, here is our next expert panel, led by Denise Zheng, Senior Associate Strategic Technologies Program at CSIS, and Jiří Šedoví, Chief Executive of the European Defence Agency, David Van Weel, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges with NATO, and Mike Vaccaro, Acting Director for International Cooperation in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, the US Department of Defense. Denise, the floor is now yours.
Hello, and thank you to the European Union delegation and to CSIS for hosting this forum. I am very pleased to moderate this incredibly important and timely discussion on transatlantic cooperation on emerging and disruptive technologies. In fact, there have been several major developments on the topic of technology and innovation in the transatlantic relationship in just the past few weeks in the month of June. And three stand out especially in my mind. First is the EU-U.S. summit, the announcement of a trade and technology council focused on strengthening cooperation and coordination on artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and other critical technologies. Second, at the NATO summit, alliance members agreed to launch a new tech accelerator and innovation fund to support the development of emerging and disruptive technologies. And third, in the United States, legislation to significantly increase funding for basic R&D, as well as funding to support the semiconductor industrial base, is gaining momentum in Congress. So clearly a lot of interest, a lot of activity on emerging technologies and on strengthening cooperation. But the question is, how do we move from words to action? So I want to begin by giving each of our panelists time for some opening remarks to help set the stage and explain from the vantage points of their respective organizations why cooperation on emerging and disruptive technologies is so critical and what they are doing to drive this cooperation. So starting with Jiří Šedoví, as Chief Executive of the European Defence Agency, at the core of your mission is supporting research and technology capability development. How are you driving investment and cooperation on technology?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Denise. Good afternoon, colleagues, and indeed glad to be part of this panel today. Firstly, let me start with just outlining two crucial trends or defining moments. First one is the return of strategic competition between great powers, and this is now a new normal. And secondly, technology plays an ever increasing role in this competition, and actually it's becoming one of its core aspects. So technology innovation is becoming a sort of a geopolitical, geostrategic imperative these days. And it's not only about nation states, because also non-state actors around the world are trying to weaponize the new technologies for their end. So developments brought by disruptive technologies will definitely change the parameters of the future battlefield, while at the same time provide opportunities to improve, for example, our situational awareness, speed up decision-making, or better calibrate effects. And in this context, there is no choice but for our defense establishments, armed forces, to adapt to this new reality, whether you are a EU member state, whether you are EU as the actor, as the organization, NATO, or you as simply to keep our technological edge, we need to join forces in innovation and cooperation, integrating new technologies in defense systems and developing defense proper technologies as well. Otherwise, we would risk losing our strategic advantage over our competitors and indeed also interoperability, and especially I would say across Atlantic. Now, at EU level, this priority is well acknowledged, including it is a part of the ongoing work on the strategic compass. At the same time, civilian dual-use innovation and investment in research and technologies is becoming a focus of what is Commission doing, especially in terms of synergies and the transfer of dual-use technologies into the area of defense. And here Defense Agency, European Defense Agency, plays crucial role. And I should also mention the European Defence Fund, which provides some 8 billion euro over the next 7 years, and up to 10% should be directly focused on innovation and new technologies. Another important aspect indeed, and this was very much highlighted during the pandemic, is the question of resilience, and resilience especially in terms of reduction of strategic dependencies. And here again, we've been working together with the Commission now on mapping those vulnerabilities and dependencies. And indeed, over the time, we must develop our technological base, which is autonomous, which is not dependent strategically, and especially on third parties that are not part of our, I would say, value system and the world. Now, EDA has been in this field for quite some time. For instance, we are running currently 16 projects that are one way or another using artificial intelligence for supporting ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, by big data analysis, or by enabling decision making in the command and control, or to support operations of a drone, of swarms of drones. To further structure our work regarding EDTs, we are currently working on an action plan which would, for the European Defence Agency, bring about the task of monitoring the trends in EDTs, identifying and exploring collaborative opportunities for member states. And indeed, also, I would like to see the European Defence Agency developing into the hub for innovation for the European Union. And I recently had the opportunity to outline these plans to the defense ministers, and I emphasized that the choice now is clear and simple for the EU: defense innovation or defense irrelevance. Nothing in between. Now we are in regular contact with our NATO colleagues, interlocutors, David van Wel indeed being one of the crucial ones, but we have a lot of exchanges on staff level with other parts of the NATO organization. Recently, there was also a meeting and discussion between ambassadors from both sides, NATO, North Atlantic Council, and EU, the Political Security Committee, focused on this area of technologies. And last but not least, indeed, what is very promising, and I would say promising impulse, we received from the EU-U.S. summit a few days ago, which set up a common vision where trade can be used to expand resilient and sustainable supply chains, as well as enhancing cooperation on emerging technologies with a clear intent to drive digital transformation. The establishment to that end of the Trade and Technology Council was a key deliverable. And last but not least, and I would conclude on this, we have received also a clear, I would say, impulse to open discussions, to start discussions with the United States on the administrative arrangement between us, the United States, the EDA, European Defence Agency, and the United States. And we are ready to do that once we receive a mandate from our member states. And on this, I would conclude my initial remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yuri. And I love how you said, we have a choice between defense innovation or defense irrelevance. So true. So next, let me turn to David Van Wiel to discuss NATO's perspective and priorities on emerging and disruptive technologies. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. And let me start by saying that I agree with everything that Jerzy has said, including the fact that we're in constant contact on this. And I like his slogan of relevance as well. I think NATO has come a long way in the past years in finding its way into the importance of EDTs and how NATO should respond to this. So it started in London during the summit in December 2019. When an EDT roadmap was adopted, identifying 7 technologies that we consider to be disruptive and that will change the field of security. And we had to follow that up by a concrete implementation plan. How are we going to deal with these 7 technologies? How do we deal with an innovation environment around these EDTs, which is not the normal engagement zone of the alliance as it was? How do we deal with innovation coming out of innovation hubs, coming out of the private sector, with sometimes the inventors of technologies not being aware of the dual use potential of their technologies, and the other way around, our militaries not being aware of the potential that technology could have, both for good and for bad, as was already mentioned, because it's not only about threats, it's also about harnessing potential. So what we're currently working on is trying to re-engage with this community, trying to re-engage with where the research and development is actually done, and thereby trying to harness the potential of our 30 allied member states. And we have our technological edge. There's no doubt about it that 9 out of the 10 top universities are based in allied countries. So we still have that edge, but the question is, how do we relate to that edge, to that technological development from a security and defense perspective? And that's where the summit deliverables that you alluded to are going to help us enormously. So the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA in acronyms, as we tend to use them here at NATO, is going to help us re-engage with these innovation hubs that are civilians, are going to connect military operators and military problem sets with the actual innovators from the private and academic sectors. And also we're going to use this accelerator to make sure that those countries that are more advanced in some technologies can actually help the countries that are less advanced in order to maintain our interoperability, which will be crucial with these technologies. And accompanied to that, there will be an innovation fund, which will be actually investing in our own innovation ecosystems from a security and defense perspective, in order to make sure that we keep our edge and that we protect our equities when it comes down to the deep tech innovation in the security and the defense sector. So all in all, we think it's a crucial field, and we think that transatlantic cooperation here in this field where our values and standards are being contested by technology is crucial. And we want to play our role in developing those standards, coming to common positions among 30 nations to feed the discussions that are going on elsewhere. Let me stop there for the introduction.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And I want to eventually dive a little deeper into DIANA as well and the Innovation Fund. But first, let me turn to Michael Vaccaro from the U.S. Department of Defense Acquisition and Sustainment Office, the Pentagon. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Denise, and I appreciate the opportunity to join my esteemed colleagues on this panel. I just want to reemphasize the United States is committed to the security of our European allies and partners and embraces international cooperation toward a better, safer, more resilient, and more prosperous world. Over the past several decades, we have developed strong partnerships between our nations and companies that we should protect and continue to foster. These partnerships are even more important as the technology race continues to develop emerging and disruptive technologies, such as hypersonics, artificial intelligence, quantum, as well as future communications and IT architectures. President Biden demonstrated the U.S. commitment to cooperation with our European partners in the agreements made at both the NATO and EU summit this month. At the U.S.-EU summit, leaders committed to raising the level of ambition in the transatlantic partnership. U.S. and EU leaders reaffirmed shared efforts to improve a range of mutual foreign policy concerns, including bolstering our collective security and defense. We welcome the progress achieved on the longstanding U.S. request to begin negotiations of an administrative arrangement with the European Defense Agency as soon as possible, which the leaders committed to work towards as soon as possible. Let us be clear. A completed U.S. EDA AA will help achieve broad U.S. participation in EU initiatives like the Permanent Structured Cooperation PESCO projects, improve U.S.-EU defense cooperation, and bolster our collective security. We look forward to launching negotiations as soon as possible. During the NATO summit, allies agreed to foster technological cooperation among allies in NATO, promote interoperability, and encourage the development and adoption of technological solutions to address our military needs. The launch of the Civil Military Defense Innovation Accelerator was also agreed upon. The United States supports cooperation to increase the pace of next-generation enablers for security and defense across the alliance. The accelerator approach complements the current work on EDTs, including what the U.S. and several other allies have already established. As with the other allies, we will be working to develop more detailed plans and commitments in time for the NATO 2022 summit. This includes identifying where we can contribute existing expertise and structures. We are very pleased that the focus on innovation and emerging and disruptive technologies is not only on the promotion of technology developments, but includes a serious effort to protect our research and knowledge from exploitation and transfer attempts by our strategic competitors and adversaries. My office supports the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisitions' role as the U.S. National Armaments Director. As part of the Conference of National Armaments Directors, NATO allies are working on how emerging and disruptive technologies will be incorporated into future military and defense capabilities. This includes close cooperation and engagement with the science and technology community to further concepts and mature emerging and disruptive technologies. Identify where these technology enablers contribute to military platforms and systems, and promote opportunities for multinational cooperation to burden share development and integration of these technologies. Expert briefings continue to inform these possibilities. Much of the research and development work continues on a bilateral basis based on common objectives and resources to support projects. However, there are growing opportunities to support more multinational cooperation if we are all investing and working toward common goals. We have heard from several NATO allies they intend to use the European Defense Fund and potentially PESCO to further development on emerging and disruptive technologies. With EDF the seed money for development projects, increased collaboration brings even more contributions to projects. We welcome the EU's commitment that EU defense projects remain open to the fullest possible U.S. participation, as reaffirmed by Secretary Blinken and High Representative Borrell in March. Establishing an effective ability for the U.S. and EU to fully cooperate on these development projects is necessary to leverage expertise, promote interoperability, and avoid duplication. As EDF comes online this year and member states continue to develop additional PESCO projects, it remains imperative the U.S. be able to join these initiatives. The ability of non-EU NATO allies to collaborate within EU defense constructs helps enable and deliver objectives outlined at NATO. In this regard, the United States welcomed the European Union's approval of U.S. participation, along with Canada and Norway, in the Dutch-led PESCO military mobility project. We look forward to exploring U.S. participation in additional PESCO projects and potentially EDF consortium, as well as improving general U.S.-EU defense cooperation. In order to maintain this momentum, we welcome the opportunity to begin negotiations on the U.S. EDA AA as soon as possible. This EAA will promote a two-way flow of information and opportunities to ensure coherence of defense plans and activities that will be instrumental in fulfilling defense-related desires related to emerging and disruptive technologies. The AA will also open the door to U.S. participation in the full range of PESCO projects, including those for which EDA provides support. We look forward to continuing the discussions on this, and we're confident we can meet our leaders' intent to further bolster the transatlantic partnership. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you so much, Michael. And it sounds like from our panelists here that there's just a tremendous amount of energy around this and very good groundwork for cooperation. I want to give Yuri a moment to just respond to the U.S. EDA agreement that Michael just talked about, and also ask the question more generally to our panelists, what makes these commitments now different from before? We've always known that technology and EDTs are so critically important to our ability to defend against threats, but why the greater focus now and why the more momentum to collaborate? So two-part question, first starting with Yuri.
I will start with the second part of your question, or second question, and indeed, it's the agency of the international environment. It's the escalation in the global competition amongst great powers, which I mentioned, and COVID pandemics actually, I would say, sharpen it or spilled over it into new areas. And above all, it's the fast growth and fast entry of technologies into the area of defense, into all areas, actually, of human activities, including defense, I should say. And last but not least, indeed, it's the narrowing gap or a narrowing headway vis-a-vis our competitors or potential adversaries, and the use of various technologies across the board, to start with the weaponization, but also in the area of hybrid warfare or hybrid challenges, digital world, cyber, etc., etc. So the urgency cannot be overstated, I would say, and it's very clear. And it's the challenge against the West. This is immensely important to realize. And indeed, here, NATO and EU are two pillars of the West, and therefore the cooperation, coordination, complementarity, synergy is more urgent than ever. And now on that particular issue of the administrative arrangement with the US, it's important, and Michael mentioned it, that this will establish a framework for two-way first exchange of information, of mutually, I would say, advantages, win-win, mutually value-added potential cooperation with all transparency and reciprocity that must be assured. And indeed, I should also mention one issue which is important to solve before we can start those discussions, and it will be definitely part of the mandate, and it's the issue of international trade in arms regulation, means the export controls, US export controls, and this is something which is for many EU member states an issue of increased importance. So I think that it would be useful also for the US to learn more about what we do, the structure of our activities, our projects, and indeed the potential opportunities, and perhaps also to define the priorities. At the same time, also to have a good idea where the US will, through this cooperation, exchange of information, contribute to the goals of the European security and defense policy, because this is one of the stated conditions for opening administrative arrangement with any third party.
Great. And David, any reactions from you?
No, I fully agree. I think that the key ingredient is that we are re-entering a period of strategic competition. And that was recognized at the NATO summit as well. And this competition is partly in the area of EDTs and technology and standard setting. And as Jerzy said, it is the values of the West that are at stake here, also in the security and defense domain. So it's absolutely crucial that we come together, that we re-engage to these technological developments, that we come ahead of the curve, that we are not surprised by the security implications of new technologies, but that we have been aware, we have been monitoring them, we know what their military defense and security use cases could be, and we've entered into discussions on regulating, making sure that our values will be baked into the worldwide standards that these technologies will bring. I think these are crucial ingredients for the coming years. We are not too late to the party, but it's high time that we put our full focus into this. And fortunately, politically, this is also recognized and seen as a huge priority here at NATO, but also by the US and the EU, as we hear today.
I want to zoom in on NATO's emerging and disruptive technologies, the list of 7 technologies, which I imagine sort of all the folks on this panel have zoomed in on as well in their work. It's interesting to me that missing from this list are things like 5G and cybersecurity. Perhaps they're not so emerging anymore; they're very much here, but they're incredibly disruptive. And I don't know that we're yet tackling the threats from cyber and 5G effectively in the transatlantic relationship and individually in Europe and in the United States. So can you talk a little bit about how, why the 7 technologies and why are we missing 5G and cyber from this list?
It's a very good question. If you choose 7, then you're always going to be arbitrary. So it is the outcome of a long trajectory in which we come up with these 7. And these 7 are also not in the same stage of development or impact to our security environment. There are some that are a bit further down the way. If we look at bioengineering, for example, than others like AI and data that are actually at our doorstep and in our surroundings already. So the list is always arbitrary, but the important thing is that we keep a continuous cycle of identifying which technologies might be of impact to the security in the future, then understanding these technologies as they mature from a security and defense perspective, and then finally act upon these technologies when they come into the maturity stage. And I would say that data and AI are in that last category, and we will be working on AI and data strategies as we speak. Now, cyber is indeed an emerged domain, but it's also a continuously changing environment. So at the recent summit 2 weeks ago, the leaders also endorsed a new comprehensive NATO cyber defense policy. And indeed, in this policy, you see the same idea of a permanently contested environment that we have to deal with, which asks for more proactive defense, which in the short term will ask for the use of AI tools in order to be able to defend our networks. So there's definitely a nexus there, but since it is already part of our ongoing operations, it is not seen as an EDT per se, but EDTs in combination, they're all cyber enabled, will make a big impact on the alliance. 5G, I think, has been more of a wake-up call that we need to be alert, we need to be ahead of these technologies as they emerge, and we need to make sure that we put the security aspects of these technologies as they come into real life. We need to take them into account from the early stages. And I think that in some aspects, we have woken up late to the possible security implications of 5G and have been focused on it very much from an economical and advantage point of view. So both of these need to go hand in hand with every technology. With 5G, with every development we make in cyber, but also with the EDTs that are now on the list and will be in the future.
Let me click down just a little bit deeper into, because we're talking about how to cooperate on technology and innovation, but let's talk about how we source the actual technology and innovation, right? So we can source that from incumbent companies that are already sort of very much in this space, working with the defense industrial bases, working with our research communities. We can also source it from startups to some degree. When you think about how we're sourcing the technologies, how are you thinking about sort of the strategy with which we use to source from incumbent players versus startup players? What kind of capabilities are you looking for from these two different groups?
What was to me the question?
For anyone who wants to take it, David, if you'd like to start, that's fine. And Michael, I see maybe you'd like to jump in as well.
Yeah, I won't make it too long. I think that NATO has a long history of working with the traditional industrial base. So there's a lot of activity going on there. The Conference of National Armament Directors was already mentioned. We have the NATO Industry Forum. So there, I think we are in a good place. What we're trying to establish with Diana is actually engaging with indeed this triple helix, which is the private sector, small, medium enterprises, academia, and the government in all the different member states. So there are some bigger countries that have their own ecosystems and that are able to sustain that within their national parameters. But a lot of the 30 countries, they will have either opportunities in new technologies, startups that they're working on, that they would like to bring in the attention of 30 allies. And the other way around, it is a place where you can bring your military problem sets and it'll connect you to the innovation systems within the alliance. I think that that's the added bonus and the new engagement that we're doing in top of the traditional incumbent industry that, of course, will remain part of the NATO environment.
Michael?
Yeah, from the U.S. side, one of the challenges, obviously, if you look at our 11 modernization priorities, if you look at the sectors, I mean, largely, these are sectors that are being driven by the commercial side, right? There's a dual-use technologies where DoD may account for a very small percentage of consumption. So how do we leverage what the private sector is doing to make sure that we have the capabilities we need going forward? And part of that is, my job is to promote international armaments cooperation with our partners. And so what I spend a lot of my time with is meeting with my partners bilaterally and just harmonizing what are you doing and who are you investing in, what are areas that we're doing work in, and see if we can find opportunities to work collaboratively, either specific projects or exchange information to go forward. And part of that is also getting a better understanding of who the companies are in each of our ecosystems too. But that's a challenge. Now, at the Department of Defense, in the Obama administration, we established the Defense Innovation Unit, and that goal for that agency is to go out and find those companies, the cutting-edge technology guys, the folks at 128 in the Silicon Valley, and encourage them to start doing business with the Department of Defense. And so we're totally supportive of what NATO is trying to do on the innovation agenda and accelerators. But again, another key aspect of this is making sure that those small and medium-sized enterprises, which are really these incubators for future technology that we will likely try to leverage going forward, that there can be trusted suppliers going forward. And part of that may mean making sure we're sharing information or making sure that for export controls purposes, we're controlling the technology appropriately, but also, trusted capital. A lot of what our small and medium-sized companies is, it's tough to become successful. And if someone for venture capitalist comes in and offers you a lot of money, you're going to be often eager to accept that money to help your company long term. But where is that money actually coming from, and what kind of national security implications does that have? And that's a big part of what we're trying to spend. The foreign investment screening, I think, is going to be even more critical as we go forward. And we've been starting to engage more and more with our partners and allies, including at NATO, on that specific issue.
Thank you, Michael. And I realized we didn't have a chance to really take any questions from the audience, but I want to surface this one question, and I would offer it to our European colleagues on the panel for a very quick response. A question from Stephen Shapiro at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center regarding NATO and cyber, but I think this is much broader in many ways beyond cyber, right? So NATO continues to leave offensive cyber to each of its member states, each of whom have different capabilities. And so the question is, when it comes to coordination on our offensive capabilities, where is the strategic coordination?
Yeah, let me lead on that. NATO is in its core a defensive alliance, and all the capacities that NATO employs come from the allies. So from that perspective, cyber is not different. So the question is, how do you incorporate offensive cyber capabilities that are provided by allies into operations? I think that's the main key, and I think that's the main focus between our strategic commands now, is to make sure that in their contingency planning, in their preparation for future operations, that they get a good understanding of what the individual allies have offered and how this relates to their contingency plans. So there is coordination, definitely. We know, of course, what NATO allies individually have offered, and it's up to the military to incorporate it, as cyber is now one of the operational domains.
Great. And Jerry, I think you maybe wanted to offer a comment as well.
I mean, in EU, we don't deal with collective defense as such, so it's more about cyber resilience. And indeed, as we know, that those offensive or active defensive capabilities are developed in the member states or allies, and then might be under certain conditions delegated to the operational commander in NATO. So what is important is that we, and again, lesson learned from very aggressive cyber attacks during the pandemics, for example, against hospitals, very aggressive also disinformation campaigns, but also the hacking attacks, for example, against critical infrastructures in the US. I mean, this is really a big issue. So cyber resilience and resilience as such is even more than before the name of the game, and new technologies, disruptive technologies are part of that, both as on the side of the solutions, but indeed also employing them creates new dependencies, new vulnerabilities, and this is something which definitely will be addressed, will be one of the main themes for the transatlantic dialogue, or dialogue between the EU-U.S., EU-NATO in this area in the foreseeable future.
Wonderful. Well, I wish we had another hour to discuss, because I'm sure we could dive deep into all of these topics. With 30 minutes, it's hard to cover anything in a deep way. But I thought this conversation was incredibly enlightening and useful, and just demonstrates how much desire and energy and already resources being put behind strengthening the transatlantic relationship on emerging and disruptive technologies. I'm extraordinarily hopeful that we will see real major outcomes from this strengthening of our work together. And I wish you all the best of luck, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you again, our panelists. Now, to conclude today's discussions on the Defense Forum and to give a preview of what we can expect tomorrow, I welcome back Heather Conley, Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic at the CSIS. Heather, over to you again.
Well, Thank you so very much. It's hard to believe day one has already finished. What a rich discussion we had. I'd like to, in many ways, end where we began. by thanking our viewers for joining us for this conversation. I'd also, again, like to thank High Representative Burrell and Principal Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner for opening up this conversation and allowing us a deep dive into strategic competition, how the U.S. and the EU, our partnership is working in the strategic areas of China, Russia, and emerging technologies. We can't wait for tomorrow because we're going to dive more deeply into climate security with specific focus on the Arctic. This is something that CSIS has dedicated itself to its research, and we're very excited to have an Arctic conversation with our EU colleagues. We're going to dive into Africa, an issue of important concern to our EU partners as well as to the U.S. security and defense community. Another rich conversation on NATO and EU cooperation, particularly in military mobility. You've heard that a lot today. We're going to focus on that. And then, of course, we have to return to technologies. And of course, this last panel was so important, how we're joining together and thinking through making sure that future military capabilities have the latest technological edge. So stay tuned. Please join us tomorrow morning beginning at 9:30. And thank you again on behalf of the entire family at CSIS and our partners, the European Union Delegation. It has been a great first day. We're looking forward to welcoming you back tomorrow.
Thank you, Heather. I think we really had an excellent set of discussions, as Heather said, with many perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic. It is really striking how similar our concerns and preoccupations are, and how similarly we see the main security challenges of today. This also means a lot of potential to deepen our cooperation further. I'm very much looking forward to tomorrow's conversations, and I would like to thank all our participants once more, and of course our viewers also for joining us today for this enlightening conference. Please do keep the discussions going online. You can share your thoughts with the other audience with the hashtag EU Defense. And as Heather said, we'll see you back here tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, when we will discuss security implications of the climate change, also transatlantic cooperation in Africa, EU-NATO-U.S. cooperation, and many more topics. Until then, from here, Tallinn, Estonia, a good day for our friends in the United States, or a good evening for our friends in Europe, and see you all tomorrow.